Your teachers lied to you not once, not twice, 111 times. Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian. Slaves didn't build the pyramids. And the Civil War? Your textbook got that completely wrong too. Everything you memorized, highlighted, and got tested on. Carefully selected, carefully edited, and handed to you as fact. We're about to burn your entire history education to the ground in the next few minutes. And by number 47, you're going to want to throw your old textbooks out the window. Smash that hype button right now because your friends still believe this stuff. And honestly, they need to be saved. 1. Romans had a secret vomit room called the vomitorium, where toga-wearing guys would casually puke between dinner courses just to eat more food. And your teacher told you this like it was totally normal Roman behavior. Here is the plot twist nobody mentioned in class. A vomitorium was just a stadium exit tunnel where crowds poured out after watching gladiators. No, purging happened there whatsoever. The entire Roman Empire got labeled as professional vomiters for centuries because of one badly misread Latin word. Your history teacher owed Rome a serious apology. 2. Medieval people never bathed and just walked around smelling like absolute garbage for their entire lives. And your teacher probably said this with complete confidence. Except medieval Europe had public bathhouses everywhere, and people actually enjoyed going to them regularly. Towns had dedicated bath days. People scrubbed themselves weekly. The whole unwashed peasant image was basically invented later to make medieval folks look primitive. Your teacher casually slandered an entire 1,000-year civilization over a hygiene myth, while you sat there believing every single word without question. 3. Pilgrims showed up to America looking like a Halloween costume according to every textbook ever printed. Black clothes, giant buckle hats, zero personality. Except that image was completely made up by 19th century illustrators who apparently just felt like dressing the pilgrims however they wanted. Real pilgrims actually wore colorful clothing in greens, reds, and browns, like normal human beings. Nobody was walking around Plymouth Rock looking like a discount Halloween decoration. Your teacher showed you those buckle hat drawings for years, and not a single person in the education system thought to fact-check a costume. 4. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and every slave in America walked free, and your teacher probably made it sound like the most complete victory in history. Except Lincoln specifically exempted border states that were still loyal to the Union from the proclamation entirely. Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and Delaware kept slavery completely legal that day. The document only applied to Confederate states which were not even listening to Lincoln anyway. So, the most famous freedom document in American history technically freed people where Lincoln had no authority and ignored places where he actually did. 5. Scientists say humans only use 10% of their brains. And your teacher repeated this like established medical fact, probably while tapping their own head dramatically. Brain scans show virtually every region of the human brain lights up with activity, including during sleep. Nobody is walking around with 90% of their skull just empty and unused. This myth likely started from misquoted psychology research, and then Hollywood ran with it for decades. The human brain burns 20% of your body's energy daily. That is not the behavior of an organ that is mostly switched off. 6. France surrenders in every single war. And your teacher, or at least every American comedian, treated this as historical fact written in stone. France has actually fought more wars than any other European nation in recorded history, and won the majority of them by a significant margin. Over 1,000 military victories are documented. The French army once dominated Europe so completely that everyone else was genuinely terrified of them for centuries. One rough stretch during World War II somehow erased all of that from the American classroom forever and replaced it with a punchline your teacher happily repeated. 7. Cleopatra was Egyptian and ruled Egypt, and your teacher probably had her drawn in Egyptian clothing surrounded by pyramids, like she belonged on a hieroglyph. Cleopatra was actually Greek. She was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which descended directly from one of Alexander the Great's generals. Her family had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries without bothering to learn the Egyptian language. Cleopatra was actually the first in her entire family line to even speak Egyptian. She was basically a Greek queen sitting on an Egyptian throne, while everyone around her called her a native. 8. Medieval people all died at 35 years old, And your teacher used this statistic to make the Middle Ages sound like an apocalyptic death trap where nobody survived long enough to have a midlife crisis. The number was completely skewed by catastrophic child mortality rates. Babies and young children died in enormous numbers, which dragged the average way down. Adults who actually survived childhood regularly lived into their 60s and 70s. A medieval farmer who made it to age 25 had a very reasonable shot at becoming an old man. Your teacher just forgot to mention how averages actually work. 9. Thanksgiving was this beautiful, peaceful harvest celebration where Pilgrims and Native Americans sat together as equal friends sharing food and gratitude, and your teacher probably made you draw construction paper feathers to celebrate it. The Wampanoag people showed up to that 1621 gathering essentially uninvited after hearing gunshots and fearing an attack. Relations deteriorated so badly afterward that within 50 years the two groups were locked in one of the bloodiest colonial wars in American history called King Philip's War. The friendly feast your teacher described was basically the opening scene of a tragedy nobody mentioned in the lesson plan. 10. Lincoln's entire mission was ending slavery, and your teacher built his legacy almost entirely around abolition, making him sound like a man who woke up every morning thinking exclusively about freedom. Lincoln repeatedly and publicly stated that his primary goal was preserving the Union and not abolishing slavery. He literally wrote in 1862 that if he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would do exactly that. Emancipation became a war strategy to weaken the Confederate economy, not a lifelong moral crusade. Lincoln was an extraordinary leader, but your teacher definitely edited his actual quotes pretty aggressively. 11. Goldfish have a 3-second memory, and your teacher, or at least every kid on the playground, repeated this, like it was scientific gospel while staring into a fish tank. Researchers actually trained goldfish to navigate underwater mazes, and those fish remembered the correct routes for months afterward. Scientists even taught goldfish to press levers at specific times of day to receive food, and the fish showed up on schedule consistently. The 3-second memory myth basically gave humanity permission to feel zero guilt about keeping a living creature in a tiny bowl for its entire miserable life. 12. Vikings were filthy, savage barbarians who smelled terrible and ran around screaming while destroying everything in their path. And your teacher painted this picture with zero hesitation. Archaeological digs at Norse settlements keep turning up combs, tweezers, razors, ear cleaners, and bathing equipment everywhere researchers look. Vikings bathed weekly, which was actually more frequent than most of medieval Europe at the time. They conditioned their hair and cared deeply about personal grooming. The terrifying, unwashed barbarian image was largely written by the monks whose monasteries got raided and who were understandably not writing flattering reviews about their attackers. 13. The Great Wall of China is visible from space, and your teacher probably announced this as one of those incredible fun facts that made human achievement sound absolutely mind-blowing. Astronauts have directly confirmed you cannot see the Great Wall from space with the naked eye. The wall is roughly as wide as a standard highway, and from space, that is essentially invisible. Even Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei looked specifically for it during his 2003 mission and could not find it. NASA has addressed this myth multiple times. Your teacher kept repeating it anyway because it sounded too cool to abandon. 14. The Catholic Church completely banned human dissection during the Middle Ages, and medical knowledge was supposedly frozen in place because religious authorities would not allow doctors to examine actual bodies. Medical schools across medieval Europe regularly performed human dissections, and church officials frequently attended and observed these sessions themselves. The University of Bologna was doing formal dissections as early as the 13th century with full institutional knowledge. Some historians believe the ban myth was pushed during the Enlightenment to make the church look anti-science. Your teacher inherited that Enlightenment-era narrative and passed it straight to you without checking. 15. Native Americans were primitive, uncivilized people, living in scattered tribes with no real cities or organized society, and your teacher presented pre-colonial America like an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. Cahokia was a sophisticated urban civilization located near modern-day St. Louis that housed an estimated 20,000 people at its peak around 1100 AD. That made it larger than London at the same point in history. It had organized agriculture, massive ceremonial mounds, trade networks spanning the continent, and complex social structures. Your teacher somehow managed to teach American history while skipping the part where America already had major cities. 16. The Civil War was fought over states' rights, and your teacher might have said this carefully to avoid controversy while glossing over what specific right those states were so passionate about protecting. The Confederate secession documents are public record and explicitly name the preservation of slavery as the primary cause in plain, direct language. Mississippi's Declaration of Secession literally opens by stating that slavery was their chief and greatest concern. Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president, called slavery the cornerstone of the Confederacy in a famous 1861 speech. The states' rights framing was a post-war rebranding effort that somehow ended up in American textbooks for generations. 17. Bats are completely blind and navigate purely through echolocation, and your teacher probably used this as the go-to example of an animal that traded vision for another superpower. Every single bat species on Earth can see. Many bats actually have quite sharp vision, especially larger fruit bats, which have excellent eyesight and use it actively during flight. Echolocation is a bonus sense layered on top of working eyes, not a replacement for them. The blind as a bat phrase entered the English language and somehow convinced generations of students and teachers alike that an entire order of mammals just forgot to develop functional eyeballs. 18. Samurai lived by Bushido, this ancient noble warrior code stretching back centuries that governed every aspect of their honorable lives, and your teacher described it like it was older than the sword itself. Bushido, as a formal written philosophical code, was essentially invented in the early 20th century during Japan's period of intense militaristic nationalism. Scholar Inazo Nitobe published Bushido, the Soul of Japan in 1900, writing it in English for a Western audience. It was largely a romantic reconstruction, not a documented ancient tradition. The samurai themselves never had a single unified written code during their actual historical era of dominance. 19. Egyptian slaves built the pyramids under brutal conditions with whips cracking over their backs, and your teacher probably showed you a movie scene in your head without realizing it. Archaeological evidence, including workers' villages, medical records, and administrative papyri, shows the pyramid builders were paid skilled laborers. They received wages, medical treatment for injuries, and daily rations that included bread and beer. Some workers even went on recorded labor strikes over delayed payments. These were organized professional construction crews, not enslaved people. The slave pyramid myth was so cinematic that Hollywood cemented it permanently before historians could correct the record. 20. Witches in Salem were burned at the stake during the 1692 trials, and your teacher probably let that burning image sit in your brain completely unchallenged for years. Not a single person was burned during the Salem witch trials. 19 people were hanged on Gallows Hill. One man named Giles Corey refused to enter a plea and was pressed to death over 2 days by heavy stones placed on his chest. Several others died in jail awaiting trial. The burning at the stake image comes from European witch trial traditions and got accidentally merged with Salem in the American imagination somewhere along the way. 21. The American West was heroically won by brave cowboys and settlers, pushing civilization into the frontier, and your teacher probably made it sound like the greatest adventure story ever told. What actually happened was the systematic violent displacement and mass killing of millions of indigenous people who had lived on that land for thousands of years. The United States government signed over 300 treaties with native nations and broke virtually every single one of them. Entire cultures, languages, and civilizations were deliberately destroyed. The heroic winning narrative was essentially a marketing campaign that got adopted into school curriculum and stayed there permanently. 22. Einstein failed math as a child, and your teacher loved telling this story because it made every struggling student feel like a future genius waiting to be discovered. Einstein never failed math. He mastered calculus before turning 15 years old, and his teachers consistently praised his exceptional mathematical ability throughout his entire school career. The myth likely started from a misunderstanding of the Swiss grading system, where high scores and low scores are reversed compared to American scales. Einstein saw a 6 on his report card, and Americans assumed that meant failure. Your teacher repeated an urban legend as inspirational fact for decades. 23. Bulls charge at matadors because the color red makes them absolutely furious, and your teacher probably used this as a fun animal fact while explaining bullfighting to a classroom of 10-year-olds. Bulls are actually colorblind to red. They cannot distinguish red from green. What triggers the charge is the movement of the cape being waved aggressively in their face, not its color. Researchers have tested this extensively using different colored cloths, and the bull charge is based entirely on motion. The matador could wave a beige cloth and get the exact same result. Red just looks dramatic for the human audience watching. 24. The British Empire spread civilization, education, and progress to primitive parts of the world, and your teacher framed colonialism as an unfortunate but ultimately beneficial chapter of global development. Britain engineered deliberate famines in India that killed tens of millions of people while exporting Indian grain for profit during those same famines. The transatlantic slave trade forcibly transported over 3 million Africans under British involvement. Economists estimate Britain extracted trillions in today's dollars worth of resources from colonial territories. The civilization narrative was written by the British themselves and then distributed through education systems they controlled, including in many of those same colonized countries. 25. Gladiators fought every single battle to the death, and the loser always died in the arena while crowds screamed for blood, and your teacher made it sound like a constant execution festival. Gladiators were extraordinarily expensive investments. Training a gladiator took years and cost enormous amounts of money. Arena owners and promoters were not eager to watch their valuable assets get killed every afternoon. Most gladiatorial matches ended when one fighter was too injured to continue, and the crowd or referee decided the outcome. Death did occur, but it was the exception. Killing a gladiator unnecessarily was considered wasteful and financially irresponsible by Roman standards. 26. The Spanish Inquisition was a continent-wide killing machine that murdered millions of people in the most horrifying ways imaginable. And your teacher might have implied the death toll was essentially uncountable. Modern historians who spent decades examining actual Inquisition records estimate the total number of executions across the entire 300-year period at somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people. That is still tragic, but it is nowhere near millions. The wildly inflated numbers were largely spread by Protestant propaganda during religious conflicts with Catholic Spain. The exaggeration was so effective and so widespread that it became the default historical assumption taught in classrooms everywhere. 27. Cowboys in the American West were almost entirely white men, living out a rugged individualist fantasy, and your teacher's textbook probably had illustrations that confirmed this image without a second thought. Roughly 1 in 4 cowboys working the cattle trails was black. Many were formerly enslaved men who found work and relative freedom in the cattle industry after the Civil War. Mexican vaqueros literally invented most of the techniques, equipment, and vocabulary that defined cowboy culture, including the word rodeo itself. The whitewashed cowboy image was a Hollywood construction that erased the actual multicultural reality of the frontier cattle industry completely. 28. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb and single-handedly illuminated the modern world, and your teacher probably had a little Edison biography posted somewhere in the classroom celebrating his genius. At least 20 inventors created working incandescent light bulbs before Edison ever entered the picture. Humphrey Davy demonstrated electric light in 1802. Joseph Swan in Britain had a working bulb before Edison filed his patent. What Edison actually did was develop the first commercially viable and affordable version that could be mass-produced and sold to ordinary people. That is genuinely impressive, but it is very different from inventing something from scratch that already existed. 29. Lightning never strikes the same place twice, and your teacher used this phrase constantly as both a weather fact and an inspirational life metaphor for moving past bad luck. The Empire State Building in New York City is struck by lightning approximately 20 to 25 times every single year. It was actually used as a lightning research station during the 1930s, specifically because it got hit so reliably and repeatedly. Lightning absolutely prefers tall, conductive objects and will return to the same target again and again across multiple storms. The phrase is so wrong that the object most associated with lightning in American culture disproves it constantly. 30. Gandhi was the purest moral figure of the 20th century, a universally peaceful saint who dedicated his life entirely to justice and equality for all human beings, and your teacher presented him as basically flawless. Gandhi's early writings from his time in South Africa contain deeply dehumanizing racist views about black Africans. He repeatedly used slurs and argued that Indian people should not be grouped with black Africans in South African society. He later changed some of his positions, but those early writings are documented and public. Your teacher handed you a perfectly polished statue version of Gandhi with all the complicated and uncomfortable parts quietly removed. 31. Medieval people all believed the earth was flat, and the Catholic Church enforced this belief so aggressively that nobody dared suggest otherwise, and your teacher presented this as basic historical fact. Educated people have known the earth was round since ancient Greece. Pythagoras figured it out around 500 BC. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy around 240 BC using just sticks and shadows. Medieval scholars absolutely knew the Earth was spherical and taught it in universities. Columbus was not trying to prove the Earth was round when he sailed west. Everyone already agreed on that. He was just wrong about the size. 32. Leif Erikson reached North America 500 years before Columbus, and your teacher might have mentioned this once as a footnote, before immediately returning to Columbus as the real hero of the discovery story. This one is actually true, and archaeologists have the physical proof. Norse settlement remains at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, have been excavated and carbon dated, confirming Viking presence around 1000 AD. Ericsson called the place Vinland. They built structures, made tools, and lived there. They just did not stay permanently or tell enough people about it. Columbus got the credit because his trip actually had lasting consequences for European colonization. 33. Pocahontas and John Smith had this sweeping romantic love story, and your teacher let Disney do most of the historical heavy lifting on this particular chapter of early American history. Pocahontas was most likely between 10 and 12 years old when she encountered John Smith. There was no romance. The relationship was complicated, political, and entirely between a child and an adult colonist in a tense cross-cultural conflict situation. The romance story was invented 4 centuries later by Disney animators. The real Pocahontas was later kidnapped, converted to Christianity, renamed Rebecca, married a different Englishman named John Rolfe, and died in England at around 21. 34. Henry Ford invented the automobile and built the modern world from scratch through sheer American genius, and your teacher probably used him as the ultimate example of homegrown innovation and entrepreneurship. Carl Benz patented the first true gasoline-powered motorcar in January 1886 in Germany. Ford was not even working on automobiles yet at that point. What Ford genuinely invented was the moving assembly line, which made cars affordable for ordinary Americans instead of just wealthy buyers. That was a legitimately revolutionary achievement, but inventing the car itself was not part of it. Your teacher handed Ford credit for someone else's invention and wrapped it in an American flag. 35. Sugar makes children hyperactive, and every parent at every birthday party has watched kids eat cake and immediately decided the frosting was responsible for the chaos that followed. Over a dozen rigorously controlled double-blind studies found absolutely zero biological link between sugar consumption and hyperactivity in children. The effect is entirely driven by parental expectation. In studies where parents were falsely told their child consumed sugar, those parents rated their children as significantly more hyperactive, even when the child had consumed none. The birthday party chaos is real, but it comes from excitement, social energy, and running around with friends rather than anything happening chemically inside their bodies. 36. Marie Curie had no idea that radiation was slowly destroying her body, and your teacher framed her death as a tragic scientific accident where a brilliant woman was unknowingly poisoned by her own discoveries. Curie was warned repeatedly and clearly by colleagues who were genuinely concerned about the health risks of prolonged radiation exposure. She dismissed every warning. She carried radioactive isotopes in her coat pockets. She kept radioactive samples in her desk drawer. She refused to acknowledge the danger even as her health visibly declined. Her personal notebooks are still so radioactive today that researchers must sign waivers and wear protective gear just to read them in the archive. 37. Julius Caesar dramatically looked at his friend Brutus during the assassination and said, "Et tu, Brute," making it one of the most famous last words in all of recorded history, and your teacher quoted Shakespeare like it was a historical document. Shakespeare wrote that line approximately 1,600 years after Caesar was actually stabbed to death on the Senate floor. Ancient historians recorded that Caesar said nothing or possibly spoke a few words in Greek to Brutus, but nobody present wrote down anything resembling Shakespeare's version. Caesar was stabbed 23 times by a group of senators. He probably did not have time for a perfectly composed dramatic monologue during the process. 38. Columbus died knowing he had discovered a magnificent new continent and opened the entire world to European exploration, and your teacher built his legacy on this foundation of geographical triumph and visionary courage. Columbus died in 1506, still completely convinced he had reached Asia. He made 4 voyages to the Caribbean and Central American coast, and insisted until his final breath that he had found a western route to the Indies. He called the indigenous people Indians because he genuinely believed that is where he was. Amerigo Vespucci was the one who figured out it was actually a continent previously unknown to Europeans. Columbus got the holiday anyway. 39. George Washington had wooden teeth, and your teacher probably mentioned this as a quirky presidential fun fact that made the founding fathers seem endearingly human and relatable to elementary schoolers. Washington's dentures were absolutely real and absolutely horrifying, but wood was never involved. His dentures were constructed from a combination of ivory from hippopotamus and elephant tusks, animal bone, and extracted human teeth, some of which were purchased from his own enslaved workers at Mount Vernon. The wooden teeth story likely started because ivory dentures stained and darkened over time to resemble wood grain. Your teacher told you the sanitized version and left out the part about the human teeth entirely. 40. Walt Disney personally sat at an animation desk and drew Mickey Mouse himself, and your teacher probably let every aspiring young artist believe that the most famous cartoon character in history came from Walt's own talented hand. Ub Iwerks drew Mickey Mouse. He was Disney's chief animator and one of the most technically skilled animators of the entire early animation era. Disney himself had limited drawing ability and openly acknowledged it. Walt was the visionary, the storyteller, the business mind, and the creative director, but he was not the artist behind Mickey's design. Iwerks drew the first Mickey cartoons at an extraordinary speed of 700 drawings per day. 41. Humans have exactly 5 senses, and your teacher probably drew a neat little diagram with eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin, and called it a complete and finished map of human perception. Scientists currently recognize at least 9 distinct senses, and many researchers argue the number is even higher than that. Proprioception tells your body where it is in space without looking. Thermoception detects temperature changes. Nociception registers pain. Vestibular sense controls balance. You can close your eyes and still touch your nose accurately because of senses your teacher never once mentioned existed. The 5 senses model is an ancient Greek philosophical framework that modern neuroscience has completely outgrown. 42. Mother Teresa ran hospitals across the world, healing the sick, and your teacher held her up as the ultimate example of selfless human compassion, doing God's work among the poorest people alive. Medical professionals and journalists who investigated her Calcutta facilities found patients lying on cots without adequate pain relief, reused needles being cleaned in cold water, and minimal medical intervention for treatable conditions. Meanwhile, hundreds of millions of dollars in donations flowed into the missionaries of charity organization. Teresa herself received world-class medical treatment at expensive American hospitals when she got sick. The suffering she witnessed she considered spiritually valuable. Her patients apparently did not get a vote. 43. Nero played his fiddle while Rome burned in 64 AD, and your teacher used this image to describe the ultimate portrait of a leader who did not care about his own people's suffering. Fiddles did not exist in ancient Rome. The instrument was not invented for another 1,000 years after Nero lived. Ancient sources also record that Nero was 35 miles away at his villa in Antium when the fire started. Some historians believe he actually rushed back to Rome and organized relief efforts. The fiddling story was written by his political enemies decades after his death. Your teacher inherited 2,000 years of ancient Roman political propaganda. 44. Marco Polo brought pasta back to Italy from China after his famous journey to the East. And your teacher probably told this story as a fun food fact that made geography feel delicious and exciting. An Arab geographer named Muhammad al-Idrisi documented Sicilian pasta production in 1154 AD. Marco Polo did not return from China until 1295. Italy already had pasta for over a century before Marco Polo even left home. The story likely started from a misreading of Polo's travel writings in the early 20th century, and food writers repeated it enthusiastically because it made a great story. Your teacher taught you a pasta origin myth invented by people who should have fact-checked their cookbooks. 45. Pirates made their captives walk the plank off the side of the ship, and your teacher, or at least every pirate movie ever made, treated this as standard nautical execution procedure on the high seas. Historians have found almost no credible documentation of plank walking actually occurring during the golden age of piracy. Pirates typically just threw unwanted captives overboard directly or simply abandoned them. The plank walking image was popularized by a 19th century novel, and then enthusiastically adopted by Hollywood and theme parks everywhere. Real pirates were actually surprisingly practical about captives, since ransoming them was often more profitable than killing them in elaborate theatrical ways. 46. Walt Disney's body was cryogenically frozen after his death, so that future science could bring him back to life. And your teacher, or at least every kid in your class, repeated this as established fact about the most famous animator in American history. Walt Disney was cremated on December 17, 1966, exactly 2 days after he died of lung cancer. He is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. The cryonic story has absolutely no documentary basis whatsoever. The first known human cryonic preservation happened in January 1967, which was a full month after Disney was already cremated and buried. Someone invented this rumor and America adopted it permanently. 47. The tongue has separate zones dedicated to specific tastes, where sweet lives at the tip, salty on the sides, bitter at the back, and sour somewhere in between. And your teacher probably showed you a color-coded tongue diagram as scientific proof. This entire model came from a single German research paper published in 1901 that was immediately mistranslated into English. The original paper never actually claimed distinct separate zones existed. Modern research confirms that taste receptors for all flavors are distributed across the entire tongue surface with no dedicated zones anywhere. That color-coded diagram your teacher showed you was built on a translation error that nobody bothered to correct for over a century. 48. Che Guevara was a heroic revolutionary freedom fighter for the oppressed people of Latin America, and his face on a t-shirt represented rebellion against injustice, and your teacher might have treated him with quiet revolutionary reverence. After Fidel Castro took power in Cuba, Guevara personally ran La Cabaña prison in Havana and oversaw hundreds of executions of political prisoners. He signed death warrants himself. People were executed for being deemed insufficiently committed to the revolution, including some who had actually fought alongside him. The iconic photograph by Alberto Corda captured a striking image that became a global symbol. The actual biography beneath that image is considerably darker than the poster suggests. 49. Romans were constantly drunk on wine because they drank it at every meal all day long, and your teacher probably used this to explain why Roman decision-making occasionally seemed questionable by modern standards. Romans heavily diluted their wine with water as standard practice, and drinking undiluted wine was actually considered deeply barbaric behavior associated with uncivilized foreigners. A typical Roman ratio was roughly 3 parts water to 1 part wine. The diluted drink was safer than untreated water in ancient cities and provided minimal intoxication. Roman writers specifically mocked people who drank wine straight as lacking self-control and civilization. Your teacher described a drinking culture that Romans themselves would have found embarrassing and primitive. 50. Richard the Lionheart was a great beloved English king, and your teacher celebrated him as one of England's finest monarchs, brave, noble, and dedicated to his kingdom and his people. Richard spent less than 6 months of his entire 10-year reign actually inside England. He spoke French as his primary language and viewed England mainly as a source of tax revenue to fund his crusades abroad. He sold government positions, towns, and royal rights to raise money before leaving and nearly bankrupted the kingdom in the process. When he died, he left England to his brother John, who was so bad that the nobles literally forced him to sign the Magna Carta. 51. Romans were constantly drunk because wine was basically their water, and your teacher implied the entire empire was operating in a permanent tipsy haze from breakfast until bedtime. Romans actually diluted their wine heavily with water before drinking it. Consuming undiluted wine was considered barbaric behavior reserved for foreigners and people with no self-control. A typical Roman drink was more water than wine by a significant ratio. Drinking straight wine at dinner would have genuinely shocked respectable Roman citizens. Your teacher handed you a toga party stereotype instead of the reality of a civilization that had actual written etiquette rules about responsible drinking habits. 52. Richard the Lionheart was England's greatest medieval king, brave, noble, and deeply devoted to his kingdom, and your teacher celebrated him like he was the gold standard of English royalty. Richard spent less than 6 months total inside England during his entire 10-year reign. He did not speak English fluently. He viewed England primarily as a cash machine to fund his crusades, and once reportedly said he would sell London itself if someone made him a decent offer. He nearly bankrupted the country financing foreign wars. England basically ran itself while Richard was away fighting abroad. Your teacher called that heroic leadership. 53. The Boston Tea Party was a pure, spontaneous explosion of patriotic American rage against British tyranny, and your teacher framed it as ordinary colonists finally standing up for freedom and justice. The event was largely organized by wealthy colonial merchants who were furious that the British East India Company received special tax advantages that undercut their own profits. Samuel Adams coordinated the whole operation. The protesters disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians to avoid identification. It was a planned economic protest by businessmen protecting their market share. The poetic freedom narrative came later. The actual motivation had significantly more to do with money than liberty. 54. The 1929 stock market crash triggered a wave of devastated executives throwing themselves out of Wall Street windows, and your teacher described Black Tuesday like the sidewalks of Manhattan were genuinely dangerous. Newspapers at the time sensationalized a handful of individual cases into a cultural myth of mass suicide. The actual suicide rate in America statistically fell during 1929 compared to previous years. A famous Will Rogers joke about investors jumping from windows circulated widely and got mistaken for reporting. The real suffering of the Depression was enormous and deeply tragic, but it played out through unemployment, poverty, and hunger rather than dramatic rooftop jumps on Wall Street. 55. Eating carrots improves your night vision, and your teacher probably repeated this at lunch while you stared at a sad pile of baby carrots on your tray, wondering if they would help you see in the dark. This was British World War II propaganda. The Royal Air Force developed radar technology that dramatically improved their ability to detect German planes at night. To hide the existence of radar from Germany, British intelligence spread stories claiming their pilots had extraordinary night vision from eating enormous amounts of carrots. Germany believed it. The carrot myth spread globally and somehow survived the war, the radar reveal, and 80 years of nutrition science to reach your classroom. 56. Christopher Columbus was a visionary hero who bravely opened the world to discovery, and your teacher gave him a holiday, a poem, and an entire celebratory unit in October. Within years of Columbus arriving on Hispaniola, the Taino population collapsed from an estimated 300,000 people to near complete extinction through violence, forced labor, and deliberately introduced disease. Columbus personally oversaw systems of brutal exploitation and sent indigenous people to Spain as slaves. His own crew members documented atrocities in writing. The visionary hero narrative was constructed centuries after his death. Your teacher inherited a story that skipped approximately everything that actually happened after the ships landed. 57. Ancient Greek statues were these pure, clean white marble masterpieces representing the refined, tasteful aesthetic of classical civilization. And your teacher's art history lesson leaned heavily into that pristine white image. Greek statues were painted in vivid, lifelike colors. Eyes were detailed with colored inlays. Hair was painted brown or black. Skin tones were rendered in warm pigments. Clothing was decorated in bright reds and blues. Centuries of weathering completely stripped the paint away, leaving bare marble that later Europeans mistook for intentional minimalist design. The entire Western art tradition of white marble aesthetics was essentially built on looking at incomplete ancient statues and calling the damage a style. 58. King John willingly signed the Magna Carta in 1215 as a reasonable monarch, accepting sensible limits on royal power, and your teacher framed it like a civilized constitutional moment in English history. John was surrounded by armed rebellious barons who forced him to sign under direct military threat at Runnymede. The moment the immediate pressure lifted, John wrote to Pope Innocent III, asking him to annul the document entirely. The Pope agreed and declared it null and void. John had zero intention of honoring a single clause. He died shortly after, while actively fighting the same barons in a civil war. Your teacher described a negotiation that was actually a hostage situation. 59. Paul Revere galloped through the Massachusetts countryside on his midnight ride, shouting that the British are coming to warn every sleeping colonist along the route. Revere rode quietly and carefully because the countryside was filled with British soldiers and loyalist informants who would have arrested him immediately if he had been making dramatic noise. He also never completed his ride. He was captured by a British patrol before finishing his route. Samuel Prescott and William Dawes actually completed the warning mission. Revere's fame came entirely from a Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem, published 80 years later, that was historically inaccurate in multiple entertaining ways your teacher never bothered mentioning. 60. Al Capone was finally brought down for his violent crimes, murder, racketeering, and running a criminal empire that terrorized Chicago for years, and your teacher made it sound like justice was eventually served for the right reasons. Capone was convicted exclusively of tax evasion. Not a single violent crime was ever proven against him in a court of law. Federal agents could not make the criminal charges stick, so they went through his finances instead. He served 8 years in prison for failing to pay taxes on illegal income. The most feared gangster in American history was ultimately defeated by accountants and IRS paperwork rather than detectives solving any of his actual crimes. 61. Hair and nails keep growing after a person dies, and your teacher mentioned this as one of those creepy biological facts that made death sound even more unsettling than it already was to a room full of 11-year-olds. Nothing continues growing after death because growth requires active cellular processes that need a functioning circulatory system, delivering nutrients continuously. What actually happens is that skin dehydrates and shrinks after death, pulling back from hair follicles and nail beds, creating an optical illusion that makes both appear longer. The body is not growing anything. It is simply drying out and contracting. Your teacher accidentally taught a horror movie myth as established biological science. 62. The Titanic sank because the captain was arrogantly ignoring iceberg warnings and racing across the Atlantic to set a speed record while passengers danced completely unaware of his recklessness. The White Star Line was applying significant commercial pressure to maintain the crossing schedule regardless of conditions. Captain Smith was following institutional expectations, not acting from personal ego or arrogance. Multiple iceberg warnings were received, and the standard practice of the era was to maintain speed and post extra lookouts rather than slow down. The decision-making that night was shaped entirely by business pressure and outdated industry norms. Your teacher blamed one captain for an entire system's failure. 63. Spartans threw weak or disabled babies off a cliff at birth as standard practice, And your teacher presented this as documented historical fact about how brutally efficient ancient Sparta operated as a society. This story comes almost entirely from Roman sources written centuries after Spartan civilization, and is likely exaggerated propaganda. Archaeological excavations at the site, traditionally identified as the disposal cliff called apothetai, found remains of older individuals, not infants. Sparta did practice harsh selection, but mass infant disposal at a specific cliff is not supported by physical evidence. Your teacher taught you Roman gossip about Greeks, as if it were confirmed archaeological and historical fact. 64. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake purely for religious heresy because medieval church authorities found her claims of divine visions theologically unacceptable and dangerous to Orthodox faith. Joan was an extraordinarily effective battlefield commander who had personally driven English forces out of Orleans and dramatically shifted the entire course of the 100 Years' War. She was a direct military and political threat to English power in France. The English needed her eliminated and used a religious trial as the available legal mechanism to do it. The heresy charges were the method, not the motivation. Your teacher gave you the church story and quietly left out the geopolitical warfare driving the whole situation. 65. Betsy Ross designed and sewed the first American flag, and your teacher probably had a little illustration of her sitting in a rocking chair, stitching stars, while founding fathers watched approvingly. The Betsy Ross story first appeared publicly in 1870, 34 years after her death, when her grandson William Canby presented it to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, based entirely on family oral tradition. No contemporary documents, letters, or records from the Revolutionary period mention Betsy Ross in connection with the flag at all. The story cannot be verified, and most historians treat it with significant skepticism. Your teacher taught you a grandson's unverifiable family story as American founding history. 66. World War I started because Archduke Franz Ferdinand got assassinated in Sarajevo, and your teacher probably structured the entire war's origins around that single dramatic June morning in 1914. The assassination was a trigger dropped into a powder keg that had been carefully packed for decades beforehand. European powers had built an intricate web of military alliances, guaranteeing that any conflict between two nations would automatically pull in every other major power. Colonial competition, militaristic nationalism, and arms races between Britain and Germany had created conditions where a major war was essentially inevitable. Franz Ferdinand's death just determined the specific date. Your teacher taught you the spark while skipping the entire powder keg. 67. Blood inside your living body runs blue through your veins and turns red only when it hits oxygen in the open air, and your teacher probably used this to explain why veins look bluish through your skin. Blood is always red. Deoxygenated blood returning through veins is a darker, deeper red, but it is absolutely still red. Veins appear bluish through skin because of the way different wavelengths of light penetrate and reflect through human tissue rather than because of the actual color of blood inside. If you have ever had blood drawn from a vein, you already have direct personal evidence disproving this. Your teacher taught you an optical illusion as circulatory biology. 68. Winston Churchill was always a beloved, celebrated national hero and Britain's greatest leader, whose wartime greatness made him permanently adored by the British people who owed him everything. Churchill lost the 1945 general election in a massive landslide while British troops were still actively fighting in the Pacific. Voters rejected him decisively despite his wartime leadership. He had been widely unpopular for significant stretches of his career, including after the catastrophic Gallipoli campaign in World War I, which killed hundreds of thousands. The permanent beloved hero image was largely constructed after his death. During his actual political lifetime, British public opinion of Churchill swung dramatically and frequently in both directions. 69. Socrates was executed purely because Athenian authorities found his philosophical questions about virtue and knowledge annoying and threatening to conventional thinking, and your teacher framed it as censorship of pure, intellectual inquiry. Socrates had direct personal connections to oligarchs who had violently overthrown Athenian democracy just years before his trial. Several of his close associates, including Critias and Alcibiades, had been responsible for genuine political violence and destruction. His trial happened in a deeply politically charged atmosphere where those associations carried enormous weight with jurors. The corrupting youth charge was real, but the deeper motivation was political revenge and fear rather than simple philosophical intolerance from closed-minded authorities. 70. The Black Death was a poor people's disease that swept through peasant communities while wealthy nobles and clergy sat safely in their comfortable castles, completely insulated from the epidemic around them. The Black Death killed with complete democratic indifference across every social class. It killed nobles, bishops, archbishops, and royalty at rates comparable to the general population. Joan of England, daughter of King Edward III, died of plague in 1348 while traveling to her wedding in Castile. Entire monasteries were wiped out. The disease moved through fleas on rats, which had no awareness of or respect for social hierarchy, property ownership, or the distinction between peasant huts and castle walls. 71. The Aztecs welcomed Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés with open arms because they genuinely believed he was the returning feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl, fulfilling an ancient prophecy. And your teacher presented this as established Aztec belief. This story was almost certainly written by Spanish sources after the conquest was already complete, specifically to justify the takeover as divinely ordained and inevitable. Primary Aztec sources from before the conquest contain no evidence of this prophecy being actively believed or applied to Cortés. The Aztecs actually fought back extensively and nearly defeated the Spanish multiple times. Your teacher handed you Spanish colonial propaganda dressed up as indigenous religious mythology without mentioning who wrote it or why. 72. Hitler was democratically elected to power by the German people who enthusiastically handed him control through a legitimate popular vote, and your teacher implied democracy itself was responsible for the Nazi rise. Hitler was appointed chancellor by President Paul von Hindenburg in January 1933 through a backroom political deal, not a direct election. In the last genuinely free German election in November 1932, the Nazi Party actually lost seats and received only 33% of the vote. Hitler never won a democratic majority. Hindenburg appointed him believing he could be controlled and managed by traditional conservatives. That calculation was one of the most catastrophically wrong political judgments in modern history. 73. Isaac Newton was sitting peacefully under an apple tree when a falling apple struck him directly on the head, and the sudden physical impact somehow triggered the entire theory of universal gravitation in his brain. Newton himself told the apple story to friends as a simplified metaphor for how observing falling objects prompted his thinking about gravitational force. No apple struck him on the head in any version he told. The story grew more dramatic with each retelling over subsequent generations. Newton's gravitational work developed over years of intense mathematical calculation rather than one magical orchard moment. Your teacher taught you the fun cartoon version and skipped the years of actual grueling mathematical work entirely. 74. The printing press immediately democratized knowledge and literacy spread rapidly across Europe as ordinary people suddenly gained access to information that had previously been locked away from them by powerful elites. For the first century after Gutenberg's press, the technology primarily churned out religious pamphlets, political propaganda, sensationalist broadsides, and misinformation at unprecedented industrial scale. Literacy rates remained extremely low across most of Europe for generations after the press was invented. The printing press made it faster and cheaper to spread false information just as effectively as true information. Your teacher described the long-term outcome of the printing press while completely skipping the chaotic and frequently misleading first 100 years of its actual use. 75. Caligula was so unhinged that he literally appointed his favorite horse Incitatus as a Roman consul, giving an animal full governmental authority just to demonstrate his absolute power and complete madness. This story comes from Suetonius, writing decades after Caligula's assassination, and most modern historians read it as political satire or an elaborate recorded insult directed at the Roman Senate. Caligula may have threatened to make the horse a consul, specifically to humiliate senators by implying a horse could do their jobs equally well. Whether he actually did it is genuinely unclear from the historical record. Your teacher taught you the most entertaining interpretation as confirmed fact, because it was simply too good a story to question. 76. Machiavelli wrote, "The Prince as a sincere practical manual, teaching ambitious rulers exactly how to be ruthlessly manipulative, cruel, and dishonest in pursuit of absolute political power." And your teacher used his name as a synonym for pure evil strategic thinking. Many serious scholars argue the Prince was actually elaborate political satire, exposing how rulers genuinely behave behind closed doors, rather than a sincere how-to guide for aspiring tyrants. Machiavelli was a committed Republican who had been tortured by the Medici family he supposedly wrote the book to impress. Some historians believe he was warning citizens about the tactics rulers use, rather than genuinely advising those rulers. Your teacher picked the villain reading and stuck with it. 77. Africa had no real civilization, no cities, no organized societies, and no meaningful history before European explorers arrived and graciously began documenting a continent that had supposedly been sitting in prehistoric darkness. The Mali Empire controlled enormous gold and salt trade networks, and its capital Timbuktu housed one of the world's great medieval universities. Great Zimbabwe was a sophisticated stone city housing tens of thousands of people. Carthage was a major Mediterranean superpower that nearly defeated Rome. The Kingdom of Kush predates most European civilizations entirely. African history stretching back thousands of years was systematically excluded from Western curricula, specifically to make colonialism appear more justified and necessary than it actually was. 78. The Holocaust was a secret operation hidden from ordinary German citizens who had no idea what was happening to Jewish people and other persecuted groups being deported from their neighborhoods and communities. Deportations happened publicly in broad daylight on ordinary city streets. Jewish-owned businesses had been publicly marked and boycotted for years before deportations began. Neighbors watched families being taken away. Soldiers discussed operations openly in letters home. Tens of thousands of Germans worked directly in the camp system in various capacities. Post-war claims of total ignorance were widespread, but the logistics of the Holocaust required enormous visible public infrastructure that countless ordinary people encountered directly in their everyday lives. 79. The Great Fire of London in 1666 was a blessing in disguise that finally wiped out the Black Death by burning away the infected rat populations and filthy conditions that had sustained the plague for decades. Plague deaths in London had already been declining sharply for several years before the fire broke out in a Pudding Lane bakery in September 1666. The disease was retreating on its own through a combination of factors that historians still debate. The fire destroyed a significant portion of medieval London, but rats survived quite effectively because they are extremely good at avoiding fires. Your teacher connected two dramatic historical events that happened near each other in time, but not actually in cause. 80. Ancient Egyptians were morbidly obsessed with death, spent their entire civilization thinking about dying, and built their greatest monuments as elaborate preparations for the gloomy afterlife they feared and anticipated constantly. Egyptians were actually obsessed with preserving and extending life itself. Their concept of the afterlife was essentially a continuation of living in a perfected, eternal version of their earthly existence. Tombs were furnished as luxury homes filled with food, games, servants, jewelry, and everything needed for a comfortable ongoing existence. The mummification process existed specifically to keep the body intact so the living soul could continue experiencing existence. Your teacher described a death cult and missed an entire civilization that was fundamentally celebrating life. 81. Cleopatra was history's great beauty, so stunning that powerful men simply could not resist her, and your teacher implied her entire political career was built on physical appearance and romantic relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Ancient coins bearing Cleopatra's actual portrait show fairly ordinary features by conventional standards. Contemporary accounts describe her power as coming from extraordinary intelligence, political cunning, and remarkable charisma. She spoke 9 languages fluently, including Egyptian, which no previous ruler in her dynasty had bothered learning. She was a trained mathematician and philosopher. Your teacher reduced one of history's most genuinely brilliant political operators to a pretty face because that version of the story was simply easier to tell. 82. Leonardo da Vinci was primarily a painter who occasionally dabbled in other interests, and your teacher celebrated him almost exclusively through the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper as his defining contributions to human civilization. Leonardo spent significantly more of his actual working time on science, engineering, anatomy, hydraulics, and military design than on painting. He completed relatively few paintings across his entire lifetime. His notebooks contained detailed designs for flying machines, solar power concentrators, armored vehicles, and anatomical studies that were centuries ahead of contemporary understanding. He frequently abandoned paintings mid-project to pursue scientific questions instead. Your teacher taught you the artist and quietly skipped the engineer, scientist, anatomist, and inventor, occupying the same extraordinary brain. 83. Amerigo Vespucci was a bold, courageous explorer who bravely sailed to the New World and rightfully earned the honor of having 2 entire continents named after him through his remarkable achievements. A German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller made that naming decision in 1507 based on letters attributed to Vespucci that described South American coastlines as a new continent distinct from Asia. Those letters are of genuinely disputed historical authenticity. Vespucci may have embellished or fabricated portions of his accounts. Waldseemüller later regretted the decision and tried removing the name America from subsequent maps, but it had already spread too widely to recall. 2 continents got named after a man whose famous letters might be partially fictional. 84. D-Day was the decisive turning point of World War II, where Allied forces heroically stormed the beaches of Normandy and essentially won the war against Nazi Germany through that single, magnificent operation. The Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union fought Germany, was incomparably larger and more decisive in determining the war's outcome. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people during the conflict. By the time D-Day happened in June 1944, Germany had already suffered catastrophic, irreversible losses against Soviet forces at Stalingrad and Kursk. The Eastern Front destroyed the core of German military power. D-Day was strategically important and enormously costly, but your teacher's curriculum was shaped by which countries wrote the textbooks afterward. 85. Chameleons change their skin color to camouflage themselves perfectly against whatever background they happen to be sitting on. And your teacher used this as the go-to example of animal disguise and adaptation. Chameleons change color primarily to communicate with other chameleons. Color shifts signal mood, dominance, readiness to mate, and territorial aggression. Temperature regulation is another significant function of color change. Their resting colors already provide reasonable background camouflage, but the dramatic active color shifts are almost entirely about communication rather than concealment. A chameleon turning bright colors during a territorial dispute is doing the opposite of hiding. Your teacher taught you the cool Hollywood version while the actual biology was sitting right there, being equally interesting. 86. Napoleon Bonaparte was a foreign outsider from Corsica, who somehow conquered France and imposed himself on a nation where he never truly belonged, and your teacher often implied his origins made him a curious historical anomaly. Napoleon was educated at French military academies from age 9. He was commissioned as an officer in the French Royal Army before the Revolution. He rose entirely through the French revolutionary military structure as a committed participant in French Republican ideals. Corsica had become French territory just before his birth, making him legally French from day one. He spoke French with an accent, but so did plenty of provincial Frenchmen. Your teacher's foreign outsider framing was more mythology than biography. 87. The Roman Empire collapsed and fell completely in 476 AD when the last Western emperor was deposed, and that was the definitive end of Rome and everything it represented in the ancient world. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, kept functioning, expanding, contracting, and surviving for another 1,000 years after 476 AD. It is known today as the Byzantine Empire, but its citizens called themselves Romans and considered themselves the direct continuation of Roman civilization throughout its entire existence. The Byzantine Empire finally ended in 1453 when Ottoman forces captured Constantinople. Calling 476 the fall of Rome is like saying a company collapsed when one of its two offices closed while the other kept operating for a millennium. 88. The Renaissance was a sudden dramatic explosion of art, science, and human achievement that erupted almost overnight after the dark stagnation of the Middle Ages, and your teacher described it like someone flipped a civilization switch. The Renaissance was a gradual accumulative shift spanning more than 200 years roughly from the late 13th century through the 16th century. Changes in art, philosophy, and science happened slowly across multiple generations in different regions at different rates. Many Renaissance developments built directly on medieval scholarship rather than rejecting it. The dramatic before and after narrative was largely constructed by Renaissance thinkers themselves who were invested in making their own era sound revolutionary. Your teacher inherited their own marketing campaign. 89. The Pilgrims on the Mayflower were the first permanent English settlement established in America, and your teacher built the entire American origin story almost exclusively around Plymouth Rock and those buckle-hatted colonists arriving in 1620. Jamestown, Virginia, was founded in 1607, 13 years before the Mayflower landed at Plymouth. It was the first permanent English settlement in America, and it survived despite catastrophic early hardships including starvation, disease, and violent conflict. The Pilgrims get vastly more historical attention primarily because New England writers and educators dominated American historical narrative production throughout the 19th century, and enthusiastically promoted their own regional ancestors as the true founding story of the nation. 90. Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama, because she was physically exhausted after a long, hard day of work, and her tired feet simply would not carry her to the back of that bus one more time. Rosa Parks herself explicitly corrected this narrative repeatedly throughout her lifetime. She stated clearly that she was not physically tired. She was tired of giving in to an unjust system. Her act was also not spontaneous. Parks was a trained civil rights activist and NAACP secretary who had studied nonviolent resistance tactics. The Montgomery bus boycott was a carefully coordinated campaign. Your teacher replaced a deliberate act of strategic resistance with a charming story about sore feet. 91. Humans swallow 8 spiders per year while sleeping. And your teacher, or at least every school cafeteria conversation, treated this as a verified biological fact that made bedtime significantly more horrifying than it needed to be. Spiders actively avoid sleeping humans. A sleeping person produces vibrations from breathing, a heartbeat, and body heat that register as serious danger signals to any nearby spider. The 8 spiders figure was invented in 1993 by a columnist specifically demonstrating how easily people believe ridiculous things they read. It was a made-up number proving a point about gullibility that then immediately became the exact kind of fact it was mocking. 92. The Wright brothers had no real predecessors and invented powered flight entirely from scratch through pure American genius, and your teacher presented Kitty Hawk as the moment humanity went from nothing to everything in aviation. German engineer Otto Lilienthal made over 2,000 controlled glider flights before dying in a crash in 1896. The Wright brothers directly studied his published research and openly credited him as their primary inspiration. They were building on documented existing work, not starting from zero. Powered flight was an international collaborative achievement spanning decades of incremental progress. Your teacher handed 2 brothers from Ohio sole credit for a global scientific effort spanning multiple countries and generations. 93. Ancient Romans all spoke Latin everywhere across the entire empire, and Latin was the universal language binding together every citizen from Britain to Egypt under one common tongue. Most people in the eastern half of the Roman Empire spoke Greek as their primary everyday language. Roman emperors conducted official business in Greek regularly. The New Testament was written in Greek, not Latin, because that was the common language across the eastern Mediterranean world Rome governed. Latin dominated the western provinces, while Greek dominated the east. The empire was functionally bilingual at its administrative core. Your teacher taught you one language for an empire that explicitly operated in 2. 94. Martin Luther dramatically nailed his famous 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Castle Church in a bold theatrical act of defiance that launched the Protestant Reformation with a single, powerful gesture. Most historians believe Luther mailed his theses to Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz as a formal academic letter rather than staging a dramatic public nailing. The nailing story appeared in accounts written decades after the event by people who were not present. Philip Melanchthon popularized the dramatic version years later. Luther himself never described nailing anything. The Reformation was real and genuinely revolutionary, but your teacher's version of its opening scene was probably a retrospective dramatization rather than documented historical fact. 95. Columbus discovered America and deserves full credit for finding a continent that nobody in the civilized world knew existed before his 3 ships crossed the Atlantic in 1492 and changed everything forever. The Taino people had lived on those islands for thousands of years before Columbus arrived, making the discovery framing immediately problematic. Leif Erikson established a documented Norse settlement in Newfoundland around 1000 AD, 5 centuries earlier. There is also evidence suggesting Polynesian contact with South America predating Columbus. Columbus gets credited because his voyage initiated permanent sustained contact between Europe and the Americas. Finding something millions of people already lived on has a complicated definition of discovery. 96. Martin Luther King Jr. was universally beloved by Americans during his lifetime, and the entire country stood united behind his message of equality and justice as he led the civil rights movement. A 1966 Gallup poll taken during King's lifetime showed that 63% of Americans held an unfavorable view of him. He was under constant FBI surveillance authorized by Robert Kennedy. J. Edgar Hoover called him the most dangerous man in America. Northern white Americans frequently opposed his campaigns, even while claiming to support civil rights in principle. The unanimous national hero status was largely constructed after his assassination, when disagreeing with him became socially much more complicated than it had been during his actual lifetime. 97. Alexander Fleming accidentally discovered penicillin when he carelessly left a petri dish out before a vacation, and returned to find mold had killed his bacteria sample in what became history's luckiest mistake. Fleming noticed the contaminated dish, recognized immediately that something extraordinary was happening, and deliberately investigated it with scientific rigor, rather than throwing it away as a ruined experiment. Calling it purely accidental erases the trained observational skill that made the discovery meaningful. Countless scientists before Fleming had probably seen similar mold contamination and discarded it. Fleming's genius was recognizing significance where others saw only contamination. Your teacher's accident story accidentally erased the actual scientific skill involved. 98. History is a reliable, objective, factual record of everything that actually happened in the past. And your teacher presented the textbook as essentially a complete neutral account of human events compiled from verified evidence. History is written, curated, and edited by people who have perspectives, agendas, and access to only some available evidence. Entire civilizations have been erased from official historical records by conquering powers who controlled what got written down and preserved afterward. The version of history taught in any country's schools consistently reflects what that country's government and culture considers worth remembering. Your teacher handed you one carefully selected version of the past and called it the whole story. 99. Julius Caesar was born by a cesarean section, and that dramatic surgical birth is literally where the procedure got its name, making Caesar's origin story one of medicine's most famous historical connections. Caesar's mother Aurelia lived for decades after his birth and remained an active presence in his life and political career. In ancient Rome, cesarean sections were performed exclusively on women who were already dead or dying, specifically to save the infant. Surviving the procedure was medically impossible with ancient surgical knowledge. The name connection is almost certainly a coincidence or later folk etymology. Your teacher connected two things that sounded related without checking whether the mother's survival made the entire story medically impossible. 100. Medieval serfs lived in constant misery, worked every single day of their lives in brutal conditions, and had absolutely no rest, leisure, or enjoyment available to them under the crushing weight of the feudal system. Medieval agricultural workers actually observed an enormous number of religious holidays and feast days throughout the calendar year. Estimates suggest medieval peasants had somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks of non-working days annually, through a combination of Sundays and Saints' days. That exceeds the paid leave available to most modern American workers today. Your teacher painted a picture of relentless, grinding misery while accidentally describing people who had more guaranteed days off than the average contemporary American employee currently receives. 101. Blackbeard was the deadliest, most violent pirate who ever terrorized the seas, and your teacher described him like a non-stop killing machine who left destruction everywhere his ship appeared on the horizon. Blackbeard almost never actually killed anyone. His entire power was built on theatrical intimidation and carefully constructed reputation. He tied slow-burning fuses into his beard during confrontations to surround his face with smoke and appeared genuinely demonic to terrified sailors. Most ships surrendered without a fight specifically because his reputation was so terrifying. He preferred surrenders over battles because fighting was expensive and dangerous. Your teacher taught you the legend while the real Blackbeard was essentially running a very successful psychological operation. 102. The Apollo 11 moon landing was a smooth, flawless operation that went almost perfectly according to plan. And your teacher described Neil Armstrong's giant leap. Like everything leading up to it was completely under control. Seconds before touchdown, the lunar module's guidance computer triggered a series of critical overload alarms that nobody at Mission Control had ever encountered during training simulations. Flight controller Steve Bales had approximately 30 seconds to decide whether to abort the entire landing. He called go based on incomplete understanding of what the alarms meant. The landing succeeded, but it came extraordinarily close to being aborted due to a computer error that could have ended the mission entirely before Armstrong ever touched the surface. 103. The appendix is a completely useless leftover organ from human evolutionary history that serves absolutely no purpose and exists only to occasionally become infected and require emergency surgical removal. Recent research indicates the appendix functions as a protected reservoir for beneficial gut bacteria. After severe intestinal illness like cholera or dysentery strips the digestive system of its bacterial populations, the appendix may help recolonize the gut with healthy bacteria needed for normal digestion. Populations without appendixes show higher rates of certain intestinal complications following severe illness. Your teacher taught you it was biological junk mail sitting in your abdomen, while researchers were actively discovering it had a purpose the whole time. 104. Abraham Lincoln was a consistent, lifelong champion of racial equality, who always believed in the full social and political equality of Black Americans, and your teacher built his entire legacy on that moral foundation. During the famous 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln explicitly stated that he did not believe in social and political equality between white and Black people. He said he did not favor Black people voting, serving on juries, or intermarrying with white people. Lincoln's views genuinely evolved significantly over time, and his later actions were consequential and real. But your teacher handed you the fully evolved final version while erasing the complicated earlier positions that Lincoln himself actually said out loud in public. 105. Hannibal's war elephants were the most terrifying and decisive weapon he used against Rome, and your teacher described those elephants charging through Roman formations like unstoppable ancient tanks, crushing everything in their path. Most of Hannibal's elephants died crossing the Alps before any significant battle even began. The brutal mountain conditions, freezing temperatures, and treacherous terrain killed the majority of his elephant corps during the crossing itself. The few surviving elephants played relatively minor roles in actual battles against Roman forces. One elephant named Surus possibly survived the entire Italian campaign, but the Grand Elephant Army your teacher described was essentially gone before Hannibal reached anyone worth fighting. 106. The Black Death spread exclusively through rats and the fleas they carried, and your teacher described medieval Europe's catastrophe as a rodent-driven disaster that humans could do nothing about without understanding germ theory. Human-to-human transmission through pneumonic plague spread by coughing and breathing was equally significant in driving the epidemic's devastating speed and reach. Pneumonic plague has an almost 100% fatality rate without treatment, and spreads through respiratory contact between people with no rats required anywhere in the transmission chain. The epidemic had two simultaneous biological engines running at once. Your teacher taught you one of them and left out the airborne version that spread directly between people in close contact. 107. The Mayflower Pilgrims came to America seeking religious freedom, and having found it, they became champions of tolerance and openness, welcoming all faiths to their New World experiment in liberty and conscience. The Pilgrims were fleeing religious persecution in England and then immediately established their own religious persecution in Massachusetts. Quakers were publicly flogged, banished, and in several cases executed in Puritan New England. Catholics were unwelcome. Religious dissenters like Roger Williams were expelled and forced to found entirely separate colonies. They wanted freedom specifically for their own religious practice and showed remarkably little interest in extending that same freedom to anyone who believed differently than they did. 108. America has always operated as a two-party political system, with Democrats and Republicans dominating national politics since the very founding of the Republic. And your teacher presented this as an unchanging permanent feature of American democracy. The Republican Party did not exist until 1854. Before that, the Whig Party held enormous national power and produced 4 presidents. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans dominated the early republic. The Know-Nothing Party won significant congressional seats in the 1850s, running on anti-immigrant sentiment. The two-party system as Americans currently experience it is a relatively recent historical arrangement, not an ancient founding principle. Multiple completely different parties have held national dominance throughout American political history. 109. You need to drink exactly 8 glasses of water every single day to stay healthy, and your teacher or school nurse repeated this hydration rule like it was carved into medical stone by scientists in lab coats. This figure originated from a 1945 United States Food and Nutrition Board recommendation that was immediately and widely misread. The original document actually stated that most of that daily water intake would come from food itself. The 8 glasses rule extracted one number from a nuanced recommendation and completely dropped the context. No controlled scientific study has ever validated 8 glasses as a universal daily requirement for all human bodies regardless of size, climate, or activity level. 110. Ancient Athenian democracy was a glorious system of political equality where all people participated equally in governing themselves, and your teacher presented it as the noble blueprint that inspired modern democratic civilization. Women were completely excluded from all political participation. Enslaved people, who made up a significant portion of the Athenian population, had no political rights whatsoever. Foreign residents who had lived in Athens for generations could not vote or participate. Participation was restricted to adult male citizens who met specific criteria. The majority of people actually living in Athens had zero democratic rights under this celebrated system. Your teacher taught you the marketing slogan for Athenian democracy, rather than how it actually functioned for most residents. 111. Your school taught you history specifically to make you an informed, critical thinking citizen capable of understanding the world, and your teacher genuinely believed they were giving you an objective window into the human past. Compulsory public education was deliberately designed by governments during the 19th century primarily to create obedient, patriotic, nationally loyal citizens rather than independent critical thinkers. Prussia pioneered the modern school system explicitly to produce disciplined soldiers and compliant workers. The United States adopted similar models for similar reasons. The textbooks were selected, approved, and funded by the same governments whose histories were being told inside them. Your teacher was not lying to you on purpose. They were just also taught by a teacher. Your teacher stood in front of that classroom for 30 years, completely confident, completely wrong, and completely unaware that the textbook in their hands was just someone else's edited version of events. So the next time someone tells you they know exactly how history happened, remember, they probably learned it from the same place you did. And now you know better.